My name is Markus Prutschs. I'm of Austrian origin. I'm historian and political scientist, and I'm associate professor at Heidelberg University. But my main job is at the European Parliament, where I'm a researcher and an administrator responsible for culture and education policies. Actually, yes, because in her function as chair of the Committee on Culture and Education, she is our main counterpart. As the person responsible for the committee, she is also the first addressee of expertise. She is directing the committee, so we have regular contacts at professional level with Mrs. Verheyen. For me, it was clear I wanted to go for an academic career. That's what I did after the PhD. Which I did in Italy at European University Institute. I went to Helsinki University to do research there. But then, 11 years ago now, I got a job offer from the European Parliament to work in policy advice, scientific policy advice. And I was also thinking, oh my God, what should I expect there? And indeed, it's a different world. At the same time, I would say now with hindsight, it has made me grow in both areas. I think the experience of policy making has maybe made me a better researcher, but I think it's also very useful and important to bring academic expertise to policy making. So in the end, I think I have, maybe to quote the former British Prime Minister, the best of two worlds at the moment. It depends very much on the actual question that we have to deal with. In some cases, we are dealing directly. It's more about condensing existing information, scientific evidence that is already there, and prepare it for our policymakers. In some other instances, however, we are also doing genuine research, be it in-house, or we are contracting expertise to external researchers, research institutes, or universities. So it depends very much on the concrete question that needs to be answered. Because you escape at least the ivory tower of academia. Maybe you enter the ivory tower of policy making, but at least this ivory tower allows you to see the other ivory tower with a different view, so to say. And it makes you also aware that scientific evidence also needs to be communicated to citizens, that it needs to be put into political practice if you want to change the world. And that it's not only about clear-cut decisions that are easily based on scientific evidence, that you have also to take other elements into consideration if you do politics. And I think in that sense, this has taught me a lot the last 11 years. Well, I should say, and to be very honest, I was rather thinking at the beginning, this is an interesting job, but I don't think I can make any difference because these are politicians, it's all about ideology, and that you cannot really inform political decisions by scientific evidence. But I should also say I learned here a lesson for myself. That's not the case, at least not in the context I'm working in. There might be contexts where it's harder to get also scientific messages and scientific evidence across, but not in the context I learned, namely the European policy-making context, where I really learned if there is a sufficient degree of trust and robustness of the arguments you bring forward as a scientist, they will be heard. Maybe they will not be put into practice one-to-one, but for sure you will be listened to, and many of your ideas might be taken on board by policymakers. First of all, I find it still amazing that we so easily talk about the role of science in politics. Because when we consider the underlying logic of these two spheres, we have to admit that they are fundamentally different. Politics is in the end about power, striving for power, preserving power. Science, at least in an ideal world, is about trying to search for the truth, which we never really reach, but we are aiming for the truth. So trying to bring those two together is already quite a challenge. And I think maybe also the misunderstandings somehow result also from this underlying logic of those two spheres, that sometimes maybe politicians, or many politicians, consider scientific evidence only if it helps a particular policy agenda, or they consider it's only useful if it's, you know, supporting my point of view, while scientists often are too naive about how politicians also need to sell certain decisions. I mean, it's easily said, okay, this is the best solution from a purely scientific point of view, but can you put it into practice? Will you get re-elected if you take that decision? What's the public acceptance of a decision? And what about other considerations like ethical considerations? So I think the misunderstandings result from having sometimes a bit of too much of a pure view of one's own discipline, so to say, politics and science. I never felt like that. I really feel sometimes in between the two worlds, for the good and the bad, because one thing is also clear, you know, when you're in between two spheres, you're always considered being part of the other. So like in academia, that's the more politician kind of scientist. And while you're in policy, that's the professor, you know, kind of bit of ivory tower person. So maybe I feel some kind of equidistance to both, but I understand also very well that I think we need to bring together those two worlds. So in the end, I think I found my peace, so to say, in that position as well. When you think about educational reform, maybe let's talk about a sphere I'm sufficiently familiar with. We have a quite clear picture of what works, what doesn't work, you know, what are best practices in Europe and around the globe. So in that sense, it's quite clear what should be done. But putting educational reforms into practice is a very difficult thing. First of all, because education policies are long-term policies, meaning you don't do education policies just for the sake of getting re-elected, because the results of such reforms might only be felt in 20 years or so. Secondly, education is very much also about who we are, about identity. And it's maybe easier to admit, okay, we have a bad banking regulation, so let's try to find a uniform European solution. But you will hardly find a politician saying, we have a bad education system in our country. Because it tells something also about, as I said, who we are, where we come from, where we are aiming at. And that's why it's often extremely difficult also to push for educational reforms. Politicians might even accept that this might be a good solution, but it can simply not be implemented because there are too many obstacles to do so. The Working Group on Science Advice, that's the official title. I'm indeed one of the co-leads of that working group, which has a double function. On the one hand, to really train young researchers how to do science advice, what are the obstacles, challenges, but especially opportunities of doing political science advice, but also science advice of different kinds. The second role of that working group is indeed to also try to establish contacts with policymakers and to raise awareness for the role of science in policy making. This is yet another difficult and challenging question, I should say, because clearly there are no easy answers to that. It's not like you press a button and suddenly everything works just fine. But maybe the most important change that we should need to see is really that both policymakers and scientists are willing also to leave, you know, their comfort zone. In other words, that politicians are willing to get in touch with scientists, listen to scientists, exchange with them, discuss with them. But that also scientists are willing to leave, you know, what I call the ivory tower of academia, to exchange with politicians, try to convince them. So in other words, that we have really a sphere of discussion, a forum of discussion in which both are involved. That's not yet a guarantee for success, but I think it's the precondition for success of a fruitful relationship between politics and science to develop. You can argue there are quite a few positive aspects. They promise transparency, objectivity, because usually we trust numbers, but we also found out that obviously it depends very much how were those numbers generated. You need to contextualize them. And the question is also, are numbers really the answer to everything? do we really want to live in a world where decisions are maybe taken simply by algorithms and the computer tells us that there is a bigger likelihood that one person will survive than another one, and we base a decision, for example, in a hospital on that algorithm. So in the end, I think we arrived at a rather fragmented picture, that numbers fulfill an important role, but that there are also inherent dangers to numbers, and that they get abused as many other tools of science as well, but numbers in particular by politicians aiming for very particular ideological purposes. In a way, they give you an indication as from when on maybe certain measures need to be taken in order to protect the public. It gives an indication about how dense the situation for the health system in a country is. But it can also become, as you mentioned, like almost a tool to hide behind, or something very technocratic in the sense of if we are just like 0.1% above a prefixed degree, certain measures need to be taken. And of course you can legitimately ask why now, why not already like 0.5% earlier or 0.5% later. And in a way it becomes a protective shield for some as well, and say, look, it's not our decision, it's the decision of the numbers, almost as if they were acting for themselves. So I think it's a perfect example indeed that numbers can be useful, but you know, there are challenges associated with them as well. Scientific evidence plays a more important role, that you see more of expertise in policy making, and the corona crisis maybe was just maybe the cherry on the top, in the sense that it became even more public, also to a wider, larger public. When you ask about the qualitative impact, I'm less sure about that. We see more of an impact now than before. Maybe it was less before, but maybe more authoritative. Because of the increasing number of scientific evidence, we see also an increasing risk of saying, that's just an opinion, not really evidence, because I found an expert who says just the opposite. So in that sense, I think the increased importance of science in politics has also a downside, which is that you can challenge more easily also scientific findings nowadays than you could maybe 20 or 30 years ago. Besides the obvious fact that you have less of personal contacts, that you have less of interaction simply, both with policymakers and scientists, has effects. Why? Because trust in the end, I think, is essential. I tend to say it's better you have a trustful relationship with a policymaker, and you will achieve more than having the best evidence ever. But if there is no trust between scientists and policymakers, you will not get your messages across. And in that sense, the corona crisis has made that relationship suffer to a certain degree. At least it's more difficult to establish new contacts. So in that sense, it had effects. It had maybe less effects when it comes to the concrete work in the policy areas. It had an effect more in the sense that the corona crisis hit particularly hard the areas I'm responsible for, culture and education, for obvious reasons, that cultural institutions, many of them had to close. They are suffering very much during the pandemic. So it means more work in terms of trying to identify what can be done about it, what's the long-term perspective for those sectors. And similar is the situation in the area of education, that we could also see with homeschooling, school closures, and so on, and the dividing gap between high performers and low performers in schools. This creates a lot of problems in Europe, but also beyond, and this also means a lot of work for us to identify possible solutions to that dilemma. For sure this helps. I mean, this is one path that you can go, which is rather trying to address the public and then make policymakers maybe following your recommendations or listen to you. At the same time, my experience has been that policymakers, politicians, are usually, at least in democratic societies, very much aware of societal needs, maybe more than scientists, because they need to get re-elected. They have more contacts often with the public than scientists. So usually you are in fairly good hands also about learning about the sensibilities of the public when working with politicians. Of course, things change when you have politicians that are not eager to listen, that are ideologically very biased. And to make such politicians change their mind, it might be more useful to do it the other way around, to address the public and make the policymakers change their mind. I would say be daring. Try to be involved, but also take the risk of getting refused. Because it's clear that you might not always be successful. But if you don't even try to get involved, to get in touch with policymakers, again, being at local, regional, national, European or international level, but simply try if you have something to say and you think it plays a role for politics and policy making. Because the biggest risk I see is that scientists do not want to leave their comfort zone. Or simply they think, oh, my message is not important enough to be heard by policymakers, or anyway, they will not do what I'm saying. But again, here we are, where if you don't try, you will never know whether it would have worked out. I would really want to invite young colleagues to consider also working with policymakers and giving a concrete societal meaning to their scientific work as well.